All right, welcome everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into this sermon that was given to both Transfigured Church Diocese of Arima and the Caribbean Apostolic Church. And I think there's a lot here for uh, anyone really who is following the Christian path. You know, we talk a lot about waiting for God's glory, but this sermon really got me thinking about what we do to prepare for that.
Yeah, the sermon uses a really fascinating comparison. It looks at Moses in Exodus 33 and then connects that with what the apostles are doing in Acts 1, right after Jesus ascends to heaven. Both Moses and the apostles, they're both sort of on the edge of these big moments, right? Like Moses, he's about to encounter God's full glory, and the apostles, they're waiting for the Holy Spirit.
Right, but it's not like they're just sitting around.
Yep. Exactly. The sermon points out that it's not this passive waiting game. Like, think about Moses for a second.
Mhm.
This is the guy who parted the Red Sea, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he led the Israelites out of Egypt. He's witnessed countless miracles, but then you get to Exodus 33, and he's wrestling with this uncertainty. And he even expresses feeling a bit lonely in his leadership role.
Yeah, I never really thought about it like that.
And then he does something really bold. He asks God to reveal his true essence, not just his power.
Wow.
Which I think is such a human thing to do. We often imagine these biblical figures as these like larger than life characters, but here's Moses expressing this longing for a deeper connection with God, this desire to go beyond just the outward signs and miracles.
It's so relatable. Like, who hasn't felt that yearning for something more? That deeper level of understanding.
And you have to remember the risk involved here, right? Like in the Old Testament, the idea of seeing God's face, that was a huge deal. It was potentially fatal. I mean, people believed that no one could see God's full glory and live. But Moses, he's willing to take that risk because he just craves that deeper connection.
I never thought about that. That's really intense when you put it that way.
It really is. And it sort of forces us to consider our own faith, right? Like, how much are we willing to risk? Are we bold enough to, ask those tough questions, to really wrestle with our doubts and to push for a deeper relationship with God, like Moses did?
That's a good question. It definitely makes you think.
So then we fast forward to the apostles in Acts 1. They've just witnessed this incredibly powerful event, Jesus ascending into heaven. They're full of anticipation for the coming of the Holy Spirit. But instead of just basking in that afterglow, what do?
What do they do?
They hold a meeting.
A meeting. Doesn't seem very awe-inspiring, does it?
Right. And yet that's exactly the point. They're getting organized. They're taking practical steps to prepare for what's to come. Peter, he steps up and talks about needing to replace Judas. They want to make sure everything's in order. It's like they're getting ready, both in their hearts and in their external world, to really be a vessel for the Holy Spirit.
So we have these two really powerful parallels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moses seeking that deeper internal connection with God, and then the apostles focusing on those practical external preparations.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder how we can be more intentional about both in our own lives as Christians today. What steps can we take to get organized, both spiritually and practically, to really open ourselves up to experiencing God's glory more fully?
That is the question, isn't it? And
Right.
luckily, this sermon, it doesn't leave us hanging. It offers some very interesting insights into that. Like, one of the things it challenges is this idea that glory is all about spectacular worship services or intense emotional experience.
Right, like it has to be this super dramatic feeling.
Yeah. But the sermon, it actually quotes Jesus saying, "What good is the glory if people don't get help, if orphans aren't taken care of, if the sick and widows are neglected?"
Wow.
So it's a real reality check. It reminds us that glory, that's not about chasing those emotional highs. It's about aligning our lives with what Jesus taught us. It's about embodying God's love in tangible, practical ways.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. Like I said, the sermon really got me thinking, too.
Yeah.
It's not an either situation. It's about recognizing that both the internal preparation, that desire for a deeper connection with God, and the outward action, actually serving others, that they're both vital for experiencing the fullness of God's power
Yeah.
and for making a real difference in the world.
I think that's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in one or the other.
Yeah.
But this sermon, it's reminding us that it's about finding that balance.
Absolutely. And we're back. We were talking about how the sermon touches on this idea of global impact and how it's not just about personal transformation, right? Well, the sermon, it specifically calls on the church to be a force for positive change, and it really zeroes in on the Caribbean region.
Yeah. That really stood out to me, too. It's not just these abstract theological ideas. It's connecting those ideas to the real-world struggles that a specific community is facing.
Right. And the Caribbean, it has such a unique history, right? I mean, so many challenges, but the sermon acknowledges that history of oppression, that injustice, but it doesn't dwell on it. You know what I mean? It's more like using that history as fuel to create a more just and prosperous future for the region.
It's really powerful.
It is, and it's ambitious too. The sermon, it lays out this vision of building businesses, supporting ministries, really working together to break those cycles of oppression and poverty. It's not just about individual salvation, it's about collective liberation.
And that brings us back to this idea of unity, doesn't it? Which the sermon really emphasizes throughout. Like, remember when we were talking about the apostles in the upper room? It wasn't just about organizing tasks. It was about coming together as one body, united in spirit.
Yeah, that phrase, on one accord, it's repeated several times, and it really stuck with me. It speaks to this need for deep alignment, not just being in the same room, but being on the same page, sharing a common purpose. And that's essential if you really want to achieve anything worthwhile.
I think that's so true even in our everyday lives, right? Like if you're trying to accomplish something big, whether it's a project at work or organizing an event, you need that sense of unity. You need that shared vision. Otherwise, things fall apart.
Absolutely. And in the context of this sermon, that unity becomes even more crucial. It's like the sermon is saying, look, if we want to experience the fullness of God's glory, if we want to be vessels for that transforming power, we need to start by coming together, by building bridges, by working together as one.
It's such a powerful message, especially in today's world, Everything feels so divided these days. But this sermon, it offers a different path, a path of unity and collaboration where we leverage each person's unique talents and skills to create something greater than ourselves.
It's really inspiring. And it's not just about warm, fuzzy feelings either. The sermon is clear about the need for concrete actions. Forming strategic partnerships, pooling resources, recognizing that everyone has a role to play and that true unity embraces diversity.
I love that.
It's like that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
And this sermon, it's definitely pointing us towards that long journey, that collective effort to bring about lasting change.
I like how it connects those spiritual aspirations with tangible, real-world impact. So often we can get caught up in the internal experience of faith, but this sermon, it's a good reminder that true glory, it has outward implications. It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Exactly. And that's where I think this deep dive takes us next. It's about exploring how we can apply these profound ideas to our own lives. How can we take these big concepts and translate them into action?
Yeah, what I mean.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about glory, prosperity, unity, all these big ideas, but how do we actually, live this out in our everyday lives?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, how do we take all this and actually apply it? And I think this sermon, it does a good job of giving us some concrete steps to take. It challenges each of us to really examine our lives, our habits, our resources, and to ask ourselves this pretty tough question. What's the Judas I need to replace?
Whoa.
Yeah. It's a powerful image, right?
It is.
It's not about, judging others. It's about taking a good, hard look in the mirror and asking ourselves, what's holding me back? What's preventing me from fully embracing God's purpose for my life? What's stopping me from contributing to this vision of a more just and prosperous world?
It's a really challenging question. It is. But it's a necessary one. And the sermon, it gives us some clues, right? Like maybe it's a bad habit that's draining our energy, or a fear that's keeping us from stepping out in faith. Maybe it's clinging to outdated beliefs, or maybe it's neglecting to develop our talents.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Whatever that Judas is. The sermon encourages us to identify it and then to actively replace it with something that aligns with God's purpose.
I like how the sermon ties us back to the apostles.
Yeah.
They didn't just sit around in the upper room waiting for the Holy Spirit to show up.
Exactly.
They took action, they got organized, they addressed their shortcomings, and in doing so, they created an environment where that power could truly manifest.
It's such a powerful reminder that faith is not passive.
Right.
It's not just about believing, it's about doing. It's about taking those beliefs and translating them into action, into tangible steps that actually move us closer to that vision of glory manifesting in our lives and communities.
I think that's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in just the internal experience of faith, But this sermon reminds us that true glory, it has to have outward implications.
It does.
It's about making a difference in the world.
It really is. And the sermon, it doesn't shy away from the challenges. Like, it acknowledges that the world is messy, there's pain, there's injustice, but it also offers this incredible vision of hope. It
Yes.
reminds us that there's a power within each of us to actually make a difference, and that when we align ourselves with God's purpose, when we work together, amazing things can happen.
It's like the sermon is saying, yes, the world is full of problems, but don't despair. There's also beauty, there's resilience, and there's incredible potential for positive change. And you, dear listener, you have a part to play in bringing that change about.
It's a beautiful message. And it all comes back to that idea of preparation, right? Both internal preparation, cultivating our relationship with God, confronting our own Judas, aligning our hearts with his purpose, and external preparation, taking practical steps, getting organized, building those connections, and then working together to actually create a more just and loving world.
That's a great way to put it. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from Moses' bold request to the apostles' practical preparations to the sermon's call for unity and action in the Caribbean and beyond.
And like we always say, the conversation doesn't have to end here.
Doesn't.
What resonated with you most from this sermon? What's the Judas you need to replace? And what step, even a small one, what step will you take today to prepare for the glory to manifest in your own life and in your community?
We hope this deep dive has sparked some reflection and maybe even inspired you to take action. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep seeking, and keep building that glory one brick at a time.